Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am your host, Madison, and this week we are going to be diving into the Boston Tea Party. Now, before the actual event that we know as the Boston Tea Party occurred, there is quite a bit of precursor information that we have to go through. Tea, for much of history, has only been grown and cultivated in China. It wouldn't be until the 1580s that tea would become something that people outside of China would enjoy. In this time, due to its expansive colonization, England was introduced to coffee, tea, and hot chocolate all around the same time. This also coincided with the introduction of sugar into the global trading market. For the next 100 years or so, tea was a highly expensive drink that was really only reserved for nobility and wealthy individuals. But as time went on, tea was able to be produced at a higher quantity and sold at a cheaper price. Now, how did tea become one of the breaking points of the American colonists? For this, we have to go all the way back to the early 17th century, where Queen Elizabeth I granted a private charter that would eventually become the East India Company. The British Empire, experiencing some growing pains after colonizing many areas of the world, just did not have enough manpower to man each of their conquests on their own, which led to the use of private charters, where independently contracted groups would buy, sell, trade, and conquer land in the name of the crown. The East India Company had been trading, making allies, and fighting rivals from its inception. With a licensed monopoly on English trade, the East India Company carried spice, silk, cotton, opium, silver, gold, and, very important for today's episode, tea. This monopoly stifled competition and did its best to take advantage of its trade networks. By the 1760s, the East India Company had amassed quite the significant wealth, and the men who were involved in the company would find themselves in parliament seats, leading the public to see firsthand the corruption in the East India Company. There were even calls for the British Parliament to consider new regulations in conducting the affairs of the East India Company. In 1769, the area of Bengal experienced an extreme drought that led to a mass casualty event due to the current estimated of 1.2 million people dying due to the effects of famine. With the extreme drought, there was no rice to consume, so the only rice available was rice that could be purchased through the East India Company. The East India Company kept raising the prices of rice while maintaining a stockpile for themselves as they watched the Bengal population starve to death. While this was going on, they also refused to stop taxing the people of Bengal, showing no relief to a population that was clearly in crisis. The businessmen who had the direct monopoly on rice arrived back in England with even deeper pockets, having profited directly over the suffering of others. Many who learned of this news, which would take some time as the news had not been widely spread, as it was not readily advertised what actually happened in Bengal. They blamed the Bengal famine on the monopolistic practices of the East India Company agents. Following the Bengal disaster, there was quite a bit of company turmoil surrounding stocks, which led to financial panic and distress that could be felt worldwide. As the East India Company stock was sinking, they were paying out dividends faster than they could make any money back, and they were having issues with their tea monopoly. The Chinese tea trade was causing a financial trading headache for the East India Company. Without any other legal competition for tea trade, the East India Company purchased increasing amounts of tea from China. But while they were purchasing this tea with plans to sell it at a premium, smugglers were purchasing their own tea from China and selling it at a much lower price than the quote-unquote legal tea. The East India Company currently had over 17.5 million pounds of tea, more tea than the entirety of England could drink in a year, and it was just sitting. Worth more than $2 million, the tea went unsold. Alongside this tea issue with the East India Company was the British government's massive amounts of debt from the 7 Years' War, or in the US, the French and Indian War. To make up some of their debts, new taxes would be placed on the colonies, and the East India Company would now have to pay a yearly $400,000 tribute to Parliament. With this increased tax burden in the colonies, the British government hardened its reinforcements on custom laws in the American colonies to make sure that duties collected flowed back to the British government. American colonists attempted to lobby against the British government, but it was unsuccessful. Many American colonists started to dissent against this increase in taxes and the idea of extracting revenue from the colonies without their consent, or rather the taxation without representation. So for now, just know that in the background, the American colonists are starting to stew on different ideas surrounding government. In 1767, the British government passed 2 laws that would affect the East India Trading Company, the first being the Indemnity Act. Under this act, they lowered the duty on all black and green tea sold in England. They also granted a refund on all import duties for tea that was being reshipped to the American colonies. The thought was that this would allow the East India Company to charge a lower price, which would then allow for more cash flow into the East India Company and less to the smugglers, who were still selling tea much cheaper. It should be noted the economy in the American colonies was highly dependent on smugglers. Smugglers were able to bring in many different goods, such as tea, into the colonies at a much lower price than any of these sanctioned ways to purchase. The second act was the Townshend Act. This act was a proposed tax on all tea, glass, paper, lead, and paint that was imported to the American colonies. This act would offset the tax breaks that came from the Indemnity Act and would pay the salaries of the civil officials in America. In April of 1770, due to much pushback from the American colonies and the East India Company themselves, Parliament over in England had decided to rescind the Townshend Act on 4 out of the 5 commodities that had been taxed, leaving a hefty tax on tea. Tea at this time made up nearly half of the East India Company's total value. It should be noted that the purchase of glass, paper, lead, and paint was not nearly as expensive as the purchasing of tea. The Patriots over in North America tried to boycott the tea by trying to appeal to the merchants and even going so far as to not consume the tea. Dealing with a downtime in regards to the economy, the colonists figured it best to hurt the British where it counted. The love for tea was widespread throughout the colonies, having become a daily ritual for many American colonists. For multiple years, the colonists boycotted tea, which, fun fact, the term boycott actually did not come into existence until 1890 when Irish tenants refused to pay rent to their landlord, Charles Cunningham Boycott. One of the biggest factors into this boycott was actually women. Women were the ones who primarily drank tea in the home and hosted tea tables with fellow women. By choosing to continue to purchase tea, some women had found their own political voice, especially after many men were not happy with the women having these tea table meetings. Women were considered to be too uneducated to attend gatherings at taverns or coffee houses, so the women meeting on their own accord deeply angered the men. But as time went on, the inclusion of women in this boycott would be more pertinent as their influence on the tea market was too great. But as time went on, their efforts weakened. For some, it was too much to ask to boycott one thing that brought them happiness. Many were still purchasing tea with little regard to if the tea had been imported illegally or through legal channels. For cities like Philadelphia and New York, they were rather successful in stopping the sale of nearly all legally imported tea, much more successful than the Bostonians. The Non-Importation Agreement, which is what the nationally recognized boycott was called, was orchestrated by the Sons of Liberty and various Whig merchants. Boston was beginning to come under fire from its fellow cities as they were still purchasing the imported tea at rates much higher than the other cities in the agreement. In all the time that the boycotts were happening, Bostonians never completely abstained from tea. A correspondent from Philadelphia states if they continued to accept duty tea, it would confirm many prejudices against them and injure the common cause essentially in the future. The Tea Act of 1773 would add more fervor to the boycotts, but that was down the road. It should also be noted that there were issues in Massachusetts surrounding the basis of the charter that they were originally granted in 1629. In the original charter, the people of Massachusetts were able to elect their own members of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. The colonists saw this charter as a sacred covenant between them and the king. In 1691, the Crown issued a new charter to Massachusetts, which changed the basis of the charter so the Crown could appoint representatives, but the Massachusetts governor still maintained the power to veto any of the appointees. The Massachusetts House of Representatives believed they should have tight leashes on the salaries of the civil servants and the governors. But when the Crown decided to start paying the governor's salaries out of the tea tax, many started to believe this should go wholeheartedly against the basis of their charter and as an infringement on the people's liberty. By 1773, the East India Company had a surplus of tea on hand, and as a way to show their dominance over the colonies, Parliament authorized the tea tax on May 10, 1773. The Tea Act would actually make the tea cheaper for Americans as it allowed for more tax rebates for the East India Company. This act also meant the tea sold in America would not carry any duty for the East India Company. Instead, the tea would be taxed at the point of entry in the colonial ports. The Tea Act also allowed for the East India Company to become the only distributor of tea to the colonies. Previously, the East India Company and American merchants were able to hand-select its cargo in London and ship it off to the American colonies. But now, the East India Company would appoint special consignees to sell tea directly to the American colonists, which meant that the sale of tea was completely cut off by the American merchants. By cutting off American merchants and allowing this monopoly to be the only distributor of tea in the colonies, the colonists started to fear what could happen if more products began to fall under this precedent. When the colonists learned about this new tax, protests soon began to circulate around, but it was not a majority of the population that opposed the tax. In fact, many of the population had thought that this tax on tea had been rather reasonable. But for the Bostonian townspeople, they fully believed that Parliament had no right to raise revenue on the American colonists without their express consent. So it wasn't necessarily the tax being an outrageous overreach, it was more the fact that the tax existed and it set precedent for other items to be taxed in the same manner, or for the tax to increase over time. The colonists did not like the British government's ability to place a tax on them whenever it felt without any input from the colonists. The underlying fear when looking at this tax was that more taxes would be on the way. The colonists knew that the revenue made from these taxes paid the salaries of the people the British government had appointed to enforce said taxes. To the Bostonians, this was a blatant example of tyranny, or a government that exerts oppressive power over its populace. In Boston, the city itself was dealing with an economic downturn. Within the span of 5 years, there was a massive fire that took out 10% of the city's buildings, a smallpox epidemic that ran through the city, Nathaniel Wheelwright declared bankruptcy, which impacted many businesses in town, and a severe storm took out many ships and wharves. So you have a population who was already down, now presented with another new tax. You also had a population that was very comfortable with spreading their messaging around with the use of the printing press, and compared to other areas of the colonies, a highly literate group. The New England congregation believed everyone should be able to read and understand the Bible, which led to such high literacy rates. This time in Boston, the 18th century, was such a time of political unrest that it was not uncommon for townspeople to tear down opponents' homes, throw bricks at officials, and brawl with officers. There was also unrest between various groups within Boston regarding purchasing legal tea. With the boycott still in full swing, the Bostonians tried to persuade their local consignees to resign their positions. The common thought was that if there was no one to hand select the tea, then there would not be any legal tea imported. But the consignees were not going to be quick in giving up their rather lucrative positions. The boycotters had a retort to the consignees not wanting to resign their positions and continue to support the East India Company, in a published letter in the Boston Gazette stating, "Secure yourself from the gathering storm before it overwhelms you with a sudden, dreadful, and sure destruction." This was a serious matter. Even so, some even argued that the Tea Act was not necessarily a bad thing, stating that eliminating the middleman made the tea cheaper. They even pointed out that the colonists had been paying tax on other items such as wine, sugar, and molasses without raising any concern. But the taxes were different on these items. The long-standing duties on wine, sugar, and molasses were designed to regulate the trading of foreign goods, whereas the tea tax was put in place purely as a way to raise revenue for the crown. The tension between the consignees and the colonists was starting to come to a head. In a letter from Oliver Cromwell dated November 1st, 1773, to Richard Clark and Sons, a consignee, Cromwell states, "The freemen of this province understand from good authority that there is a quantity of tea consigned to your house by the East India Company, which is destructive to the happiness of every well-wisher to his country. It is therefore expected that you personally appear at Liberty Tree on Wednesday next at 12 o'clock at noonday to make a public resignation of your commission. Fail not upon your peril." The day of the Liberty Bell meeting, more than 500 people showed up to confront Richard Clark, but he never showed. The group made their way from the Liberty Tree to where Richard Clark was in his warehouse. Clark again refused to resign, where one of the Sons of Liberty responded that he must expect to feel the utmost weight of the people's resentments as enemies to their country. And that is where I'm going to stop today's episode. Join me next week as we look at the weeks just before the Boston Tea Party, what actually happened in the Boston Tea Party, and the aftermath. Sources for today's episode include Defiance at the Patriots, the Boston Tea Party, and the Makings of America by Benjamin L. Carp, and an article from the Massachusetts Historical Society. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you liked what you heard, head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me over on Instagram and Threads at It's a History Podcast. Thank you again for listening to this week's episode, and I hope to have you in the next one.